20, 30 years ago, hardly anybody knew what preferment meant. But now everybody who's baking bread or making pizza dough, is obsessed with the idea of preferments and what's their purpose and how to use them properly. What's the difference between a preferment called a Poolish and one called a Biga? And what's a sponge? And what do they do? Why do we use them? So I'm going to try to cover that very quickly and very briefly here. It's a simplified version, but it'll give you enough to go on. First of all, there's only one reason to use a preferment: to make a better quality product. And because what you're doing when you add a preferment to a dough is you're putting pre-fermented dough into a new dough. And the pre-fermented dough is like a starter, whether it's considered a sourdough starter or a yeasted starter. It's essentially a flavor-filled addition to add more flavor, to promote more flavor in the final dough in less time. So if, for instance, the maximum flavor is developed over an 8-hour period of fermentation, by putting 20 or 30% of pre-fermented dough into that mix, you're already cutting the time. Instead of 8 to 10 hours of fermentation, you might be able to get to that same flavor profile and performance level in 4 to 6 hours. So traditionally, bakers and bakeries are baking everything on the same day. They rarely will make a whole dough and then the next day bake it off. But a lot of home bakers are using the cold fermentation method of slowing a dough down and letting it age in the refrigerator while it chills. But if you can't do that because you're on a production schedule and you need to be able to mix the dough, ferment it, bake it, package it, and everything else all in one day, one way to promote more flavor is to use a percentage. And it can be anywhere from 10% to 20, 30, 40, even 50% pre-fermented dough. And the two most popular forms of that are Poolish, which basically is a French version of Polish. Experience the taste of Italy in your own backyard. From Neapolitan-style pizzas to succulent roasted meats, Forno Bravo does it all. Because it was taught to the French bakers, who didn't originate anything. They stole all their ideas from other European countries who had great bakers who came to France. So the Polish method was brought to the French bakers by some Polish bakers, and it was a sponge, a wet sponge of about equal parts flour and water, meaning we call it 100% hydration. And so it's wet and spongy, wetter than the final dough, which might only be 65% hydration. So it's a wet sponge with a tiny little bit of yeast in it that's held out overnight. And it's kept at room temperature or so for anywhere from 12 to 24 hours to slowly ferment. It's just a trace amount of yeast. It can be just, some people just use like the tip of a knife worth, or less than a gram, in 5 or 10 pounds of flour. But it's equal parts, 5 pounds water, 5 pounds flour, or 1 pound water, 1 pound flour. It doesn't matter the size depending on your recipe, but it's a wet sponge. The Italians have a similar method that they call Biga, which is a firmer dough. Now, if you go to Italy, you might see an Italian baker making a wet spongy pre-ferment, and he calls it a Biga also, because it's a more generic term. It's essentially applied to all kinds of pre-ferments. But typically, a Biga, as we know it here in the United States, is a dough that's about the same hydration texture as the final dough. So it could be, let's say you're making French bread, a baguette dough, and it's going to be 66% hydration in the end. You might make your Biga 66% hydration also, and it would just be flour, water, and a small amount of yeast, no salt. Bigas and Poolishes rarely ever are made with salt unless you're in a hot climate and you need to slow fermentation down. But typically we leave the salt out because you're using such a small amount of yeast that you just want to let it have at it, and salt can slow fermentation down. So those two are the most common variations, a firm and a spongy starter. Then there's a sourdough starter, which is another kind of pre-ferment. It's the same principle. You can have a wet, spongy sourdough starter, or you can have a firm starter. But the leavening is from sourdough starter that's been, kind of fed and refed and refreshed to keep those wild microorganisms alive, as opposed to just the strictly yeast organisms used with commercial yeast. So same principle, it's just the difference between the type of microorganisms that are leavening your dough. So that's a very simplified explanation of why these are used. But by putting by putting a piece of pre-ferment in your final mixing dough, you're quantum aging the dough. You're taking a dough that's coming off the mixer, at 1 minute, but it's going to have the quality fermentation flavor properties of a dough that was already been aging for 2 to 4 hours because you've added pre-fermented dough in it. There's a lot more that could be said about all this. Maybe we'll explore it in future episodes. But again, thank you all for joining me for this one, and we'll keep them coming. Until then, may your crust be crisp and your bread always rise. Hey folks, I'm Peter Reinhardt. This is my latest book, Pizza Quest. Check it out at your favorite bookseller. And until then, may your pizzas all be perfect.